Welcome to this Generation Generous series. Over the coming weeks, we're going to be talking all about generosity and how it is we live generous lives. I used to think that in order to be more generous, I needed to see a change in my circumstances. The idea was that if I had more wealth or more financial resource, I could be a more generous person. Don't get me wrong, I'm somebody that's been committed to giving and committed to tithing for all of my adult life. But looking around the world and thinking about the issues in the world and seeing need all around me, I had this burden. Look, if I had more money, God, I could be a more generous person. And this was something that I used to speak to God about regularly. I was speaking to him saying, God, would you bring a breakthrough in our financial circumstances so that we can be more generous people? And the interesting thing about this conversation I was having with God is if you think about it, being wealthier doesn't necessarily make you a more generous person. I think we can all relate to the idea that at times we perhaps receive a pay increase or we get given some money or we somehow come into some money. Our first instinct isn't always to give away more. Usually what happens is we think, wow, brilliant, now I can afford to buy that thing that I want, or I can afford to take that holiday that I want. Just because you have more doesn't necessarily mean that you're a more generous person. And I know there have been situations where I've been involved in praying for people and praying that they would see breakthrough in their financial circumstances. And the breakthrough comes and we rejoice. And then a few months later, they come and say, you know what, I forgot to actually increase my giving. I was so caught up in rejoicing to see the breakthrough that actually the giving didn't happen, because very often giving can fall down our priority list. We have to work to put giving, we have to work to put generosity at the top of our priorities. And this is such an important thing because God is a generous God and he calls us to live generous lives. So I was having this conversation with God. God, if you unlock finance, I can be a more generous person. And God said to me, I remember a distinct moment, I was on a car journey actually from Kigali in Rwanda to Kampala in Uganda, when we were living out there, involved in planting church and leading church out there. And during this journey, I was praying this through and I was having this conversation with God. And God said to me, you're asking the wrong question. So I was like, okay, God, what does that mean? And God said this statement to me. He said, if you want to live the double portion, if you want to live a bigger and more generous life, if you want to pursue the more that I have for your life, you have to give the double portion. If you want to live the double portion, you have to give the double portion. I said, okay, God, what does this mean? And what God was, I think, pointing out to me was that actually just because you have more doesn't mean that you're more generous. To become a more generous person doesn't require a change in your circumstances. Actually, what you need to do is you need to be more generous in order to see a change in your wealth. Your generosity is not limited by the extent of your wealth. Your wealth is limited by the extent of your generosity, Chris. This is what God was saying to me. Now, I had this idea that somehow, in order for more to flow out from me, more needed to flow into my life. But in God's economy, for more to flow into our life, first, more needs to flow out of our life. We need to be generous first. We get to regulate what we have through our generosity. And the Bible speaks to this idea. It speaks to this principle. Luke 6, verse 38, you can read this. It says, give and you will receive. Your gift will return to you in full, pressed down, shaken together to make room for more, running over and poured into your lap. The amount you give will determine the amount you get back. God was reminding me that to become more generous didn't require a change in my circumstances. It required a change in my perspective and in my behavior. Generation Generous isn't something we become when we get richer. It's something we're called to be in the here and the now. Today, we need to become Generation Generous, and that can require a change of perspective and a change of behavior. So I want to talk about these two things, and I want to talk some more about the journey that I went on with God as I worked this through in my own life. The first thing that's required is a change of perspective. Now, there have been a number of different perspectives that I have had personally when it comes to finance, and perhaps you can relate to some of these. The first perspective that I wrestled with in my journey with Jesus, in my journey around finance, was what I'm calling a perspective of poverty. Now, perspective of poverty is not actually about whether or not you have. I'm not talking about actual poverty. I'm talking about the sense that whatever you have in your hands, it just doesn't seem enough. When you receive your pay or you see your money and you think, how am I going to get through the month with this? How are we going to meet the bills? What's going to happen next year? Will we have enough to get by? And we can live a life that gets defined by this sense of poverty and insufficiency. It's a fear-based perspective on the world, and it causes us to withhold in the world. We start to say, because we think we haven't got enough, I'm not going to do this, and I'm not going to do that, and I'm going to withhold in the area of giving, and I'm going to withhold perhaps even in the area of spending. And what happens as we withhold is the little that we perceive ourselves to have seems to shrink even further. God really challenged this perspective of poverty, and the challenge comes directly from his word. There are a couple of scriptures that for me spoke really powerfully to me when I was gripped by this sense of poverty. The first one is the story of Jesus and the widow's mite. And you may remember this story from the Bible. It says this in Mark 12. It says, Jesus sat down, verses 41 to 44. Jesus sat down near the collection box in the temple and watched as the crowds dropped in their money. Many rich people put in large amounts. Then a poor widow came and dropped in 2 small coins. Jesus called his disciples and said to them, I tell you the truth, this poor widow has given more than all the others who are making contributions, for they gave a tiny part of their surplus. But she, poor as she is, has given everything she had to live on. Our generosity it's not governed by our wealth. It's about a condition of the heart. It's about a perspective of the world. And God taught me that I needed to stop thinking there wasn't enough and be fearful about how we would do certain things, and instead look at the portion that he placed within my hands and see that that portion was his provision in any given season, and it came from his loving heart and from his abundance. So we needed to look at it as a handful of opportunity that first we needed to look to bless others with and bless people through, rather than fearing that we wouldn't have enough to do that. The measure that he'd given me was more than enough. The measure that he's given you is more than enough. There's something about recognizing this. You can be very, very financially stretched and still live a generous life, still be generous, and through exercising that generosity, see blessing and see impact. Some other verses that really impacted me come from 2 Corinthians, and this is a letter that Paul writes to the church in Corinth. And basically, there's a moment in this letter around chapters 8 and 9 where Paul starts speaking to the church in Corinth about an offering that he's collecting for the church in Jerusalem, for the believers in Jerusalem. They're going through a very hard time, and so he's reaching out to the churches around him, and he's saying, can you contribute to a fund to help the believers in Jerusalem? And Corinth was, relatively speaking, wealthier than some of the other churches around Jerusalem, in the regions around Jerusalem. And Paul quotes to the Corinthians the example of the Macedonian churches, places like Philippi. And basically he says to the Corinthians, in Macedonia, they're going through incredible hardship. They have nothing. And yet they've learned something about the power of generosity, living a generous life, living from a place of abundance in the midst of their hardship. Let me read you these verses. It says this, 2 Corinthians 8, verses 2 to 5. Speaking of the Macedonian church, they are being tested by many troubles, and they are very poor, but they're also filled with abundant joy, which overflowed in rich generosity. For I can testify that they gave not only what they could afford, but far more. And they did it of their own free will. They begged us again and again for the privilege of sharing in the gift for the believers in Jerusalem. They even did more than we had hoped, for their first action was to give themselves to the Lord and to us, just as God wanted them to. These were people enduring hardship in a difficult time. They were stretched financially, had very little. And yet their first action was to give, because they discovered something of the joy that comes through giving, the release that comes through giving, the power of a generous life in terms of pleasing God and releasing us into what God has for us. There's something of a liberating theology here when we move from a place of perceived poverty to a place of recognizing that what we have is what we can release. We can release what we have, and through it bring blessing and bring change. It's a hugely liberating theology for us. I found it so humbling that I was looking at my portion going, how are we going to make ends meet? And yet these people in great hardship were looking at their portion going, we'll give more, Paul. We'll give more, Paul. Let us give more into the offering. It's so powerful. So we need to move from a perspective of poverty to having a vision for generosity and operating from that place. The second perspective that I've wrestled with in my journey is what I'm calling a preoccupation with accumulation. The idea that I wanted more. Let me ask you this question. How much is enough? in our lives. Because what I've found is that I will get caught up in desiring stuff. And when I get that stuff, I then get caught up in desiring some more stuff. It's almost insatiable. You can't satisfy the hunger for stuff. If you embrace that hunger, you embrace that materialism, because I think it's fueled by greed at the end of the day. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with having some nice things in our life, and there's nothing wrong with desiring some nice things. But when that becomes like a driving force in our lives, and we keep on accumulating and desiring more, it can cause us to live a life that's caught up in that stuff, caught up in materialism. Perhaps it can even fuel us getting into debt because we end up desiring and buying things that we can't actually afford, so we borrow money from places to buy them. And I certainly saw that in my journey. The Bible again speaks into this. Proverbs 21, there's a statement in Proverbs 21 that really impacted me, partly because it speaks about some things I really enjoy. But it says this, it says, those who love pleasure become poor. Those who love wine and luxury will never be rich. What it's saying is when we give in to that instinct over and over again and we want luxury every day, we end up spending out all the resource that we have, and it can have an impact on our ability to live an abundant, generous life that God would call us to live. We need to watch what we spend. We need to watch what we spend on luxuries. We need to not get caught up in accumulation. Thinking about your life, thinking about all that's around us. Do you have enough? Do you have lots? Is there stuff that you have that you don't actually need? What does your life today say about the way that you spend your money? We don't want to get caught up in that preoccupation with accumulation. God challenged me on this. He said to me, stop desiring things you can't afford. Don't even look at them on the websites and on the internet, because it's just going to draw you in and cause you to compromise. Some others, just to reference some other perspectives that I've wrestled with, there's the too busy to be generous perspective, where we get so caught up in the busyness of our lives that we forget to look around and engage with the need all around us. Or perhaps we just give the same each month, and actually what happens is our financial circumstances do improve, but our giving doesn't go up. Or there's the consumed by a big priority perspective that can also get in the way in our lives. I know there have been moments where we've been involved historically in doing up houses, and doing up houses is hugely consuming of time, and it's hugely consuming of money. And in those moments, we can get so caught up in that we actually stop giving and stop living a generous life, and we just focus all of ourselves on that one single priority. These are perspectives that I've held that God has challenged me around through the past, and He's brought me back to this place of recognizing the perspective that I need is a vision for generosity. We need to get a vision for generosity. He's brought me back to this over and over again, using the measure that He's placed within our hand, yes, to meet our needs, but looking at it as well and saying, how can I bless others through this? How can I bless the community around me through this? How can I bless the people around me through this measure? God's given me more than enough, and as I release what He's placed within my hands to bless others, it unlocks something more from His kingdom, unlocks something more for my life and for other people's lives as well. There's a story in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 10, that is the story of somebody who has a vision for generosity, who lives out that vision, and through that generosity unlocks a greater portion for his life. And it's the story of Cornelius. And Cornelius was a man who sits right in the middle of the pivot where the gospel goes from being something just for the Jewish community and becomes something for the whole world. And what it tells us is that Cornelius is instrumental in this shift. Why? God notices Cornelius. God sees Cornelius because of Cornelius' prayers, but also because of his gifts for the poor. There was something about the vision that he had for generosity that manifested itself in his giving to people in need and blessing the world around him, that God looked at and said, that's behavior that unlocks the more. That generosity is attractive to me. And so it says that an angel of God went to Cornelius and said, hey, Cornelius, there's this man named Simon Peter. You need to reach out to him, invite him to your house. And what happens is Peter comes over to his house and Peter shares the gospel, and Peter's mind is blown by the fact that people who are not Jewish, these Gentiles, can receive salvation and receive the Holy Spirit, and their lives can be changed as well. And it triggers this incredible moment of transition to the gospel suddenly being seen as something for the whole world. And that's why you and I today stand as children of God, because of Cornelius and because of his commitment to generosity. He stood out and God noticed him. It speaks about the fact that our generosity can unlock more of what God has for us in our lives. Of Cornelius, it could be said, he gave the double portion, and so he lived the double portion in his life. And I think there's something really compelling about that example. When we get a vision for generosity, when we put it into practice, we unlock something more for our lives. It's about more than what we do with our cash. It's about our heart, isn't it? You know, a generous person isn't just generous with their money. They're generous in every area of their life. If you're truly generous, you don't just find it easy to bless people with finance. You're generous in your compliments. You're generous in the way that you spend your time and invest your time in, and engage with people in that area. You know, you're generous with your love. You're generous with your forgiveness. The world around us needs generosity. We need to be generous, the generation generous, blessing the world through this kind of generosity. So we need to change our perspective to having a vision for generosity. What is your vision for generosity today? What does it look like? What are you ambitious to achieve when it comes to generosity and to giving of yourself to people around you? You know, when God said to me, if you want to live the double portion, you've got to give the double portion, it required a shift in our perspective. It required us to think about the way we were viewing wealth and we were viewing finance and we were viewing what he gave to us. But it wasn't just about an idea that sat in our hearts or in our minds. The idea had to play its way out in our behavior as well. So there had to be a change in our behavior too. And for us, what that looked like is I went from that moment, that conversation with God where he challenged me, I drove home and I started a conversation with Naomi, my wife. And I said to her, God is challenging me on this. If we want to live the double portion, we've got to give the double portion. How are we going to do this in our life? And she rightly said to me, well, I think it's pretty simple where it starts, Chris. It starts with giving more. It starts with greater generosity in our lives. And we were already in a set of circumstances where each month, and for many years we've been in these circumstances, we were having to pray in provision to cover a shortfall in our finances. In fact, it was that shortfall that was driving the frustration, that was causing me to have the conversation with God, release more finance into our lives so that we can pay off our bills and cover our costs, but more than that, so we can be more generous. God's answer, if you want to see the breakthrough, then you're going to have to be more generous. That's what unlocks it. So we started to give more. And you've got to bear in mind that it's like we were giving away money that we didn't really have at a time where we desperately needed to withhold that money. We desperately needed to hold on to it. But God was saying, no, you need to sow in this season, sow in this season. There were some other things that we had to do as well. And one of them is we had to take a fresh look at our finances. We had to have a look at, what have we got coming into our house? And actually, rather than just saying, God, release finances, the more that we can do as well to bring more income into our home. And one of the amazing things is, when you look and you say, what is it we've got at our disposal that we could use? God often shows you a day a week that you have that you could take on some additional work, or a skill that you have that you could use to generate more income. Whatever it is, we needed to make sure that we were doing all that we could do to bring in additional income. There were some steps that we took to unlock some additional income. But we also looked at what we were spending our money on. And one of the things that we were spending our money on each month was debt repayment. Because historically, we bought some things and been involved in some things that had caused us to accumulate debt. And so as we got our pay each month, or we had money come into our hands each month, what was happening is some of that was going straight back out to repay debt. And this is such a huge thing in the world that we live in right now, with personal loans and paying for things on credit and buy now, pay later, and all that we can get offered and all that we can have access to, we end up in a place where we can be loaded up with debt. And I don't believe that to be God's best for us, because what happens is not only do we lose some of what he's provided for us, we lose some more of it as we repay the interest on that. And Naomi and I looked and we said, something has to shift here. And so we got a vision for repaying that debt. So just bear this in mind. We didn't have enough when we started to cover all of our costs each month. And we were saying, actually, we're going to give more. So we're going to put ourselves in an even more vulnerable position. And then we're also going to look to repay our debt early. So we're going to put ourselves in an even more vulnerable position. And all of this has to happen. So we're going to have a really good budget, a really good plan. These are the steps of faith that we're going to take. This is the behavior that has to shift for us. And the reason that I'm sharing this with you today is I believe that if we want to become generation generous, we have to get a vision for our generosity, a vision for our finances that plays its way out in the way that we live our lives, in our behavior. And doing this for us, there's no sugarcoating it. It was a really challenging path that we were embarking on, walking down. It was very stretching over many months. But we were kept on track by some scripture that really spoke to us in this season, and it's from Psalm 126, verses 5 to 6. Psalm 126 is a psalm all about the moment that God's people get released from exile. They'd been in exile, they'd been taken prisoner, they'd been taken away from their homes, and God had allowed that to happen to them because of some stuff that had gone on. But the time came when God released them back from exile, and this psalm is, to start with, it's jubilant and it's celebratory and it's positive, and it's a very happy psalm. And then these verses come, and it says this, it says, "They who sow in tears shall reap with joyful singing. He who goes back and forth weeping, carrying his bag of seed for planting, will indeed come again with a shout of joy, bringing his sheaves with him." It's important just to capture what's happening here. God's people have come out of exile. They've returned to their homes, their farms and their vineyards and their land. It's overgrown, it's destroyed. And they have a measure of provision in their hands. And they look at this provision and they say, we need this to live off. We need this to eat. This is our food for the weeks and the months ahead. But then they look at their land and they say, if we eat this now, we're going to have no provision in the future. So instead, what we need to do is, in faith, we need to sow what we have in our hands into the ground. We need to plant it into the ground, that in the days and months and years ahead, it will bring forth a harvest for us that will be far greater than the measure that's in our hands at the moment. And for us, this scripture spoke so strongly into our situation where we were saying, we're not sure we've got enough. And God was saying, sow in weeping, but you will harvest with rejoicing. And that's exactly what we saw happen in our circumstances as we sowed out and we started to walk this path. To start with, it was very challenging because, the other thing that we realized is you cannot harvest before you've planted. And as soon as you've planted, the provision doesn't come to harvest. The seasons, you're always sowing into the next season. So we sowed what we had in terms of giving. We sowed what we had to clear our debts, and we saw these seeds planted. And then as we waited and as we journeyed, as we trusted God, we started to see the provision come into our lives. And we saw God do more miracles and release more to us in the months that followed. We actually did see God in the coming months and years double our income and put us in a far stronger set of financial circumstances. For us, this pursuit of the call to be generation generous is built upon these three fundamental pillars. And the first pillar is the pillar of giving. We have to generate income and do all that we can to generate income into our lives, but recognize that ultimately God gives us the finance that we have. And our first instinct then needs to be to return to God the portion that is his and to have a vision for generosity beyond that. The second pillar for us was the pillar of budgeting, managing our finances in a way that made sure that we knew what we had coming in and we knew what we had going out. And we weren't allowing ourselves to get ourselves into a place of debt or a place of lack. And there's something so important in this. It's good stewardship. It's wisdom to have that visibility of our finances. And we use a tool online to do that. And there are many tools that you can use, but the most important thing is that the system that you use to manage your finances, to budget, that it's a system that calls you to account. It holds you accountable. That if you have 3 months of spending over what you have coming in, that you have to deal with that overspend in month 4 rather than just letting yourself off the hook all the time. Ultimately, what we do with our finances is entirely up to us. It's decisions that we make in light of our relationship with Jesus and the convictions that we have. But a good system that calls us to account is a very powerful thing. For us, the third pillar was this principle of pursuing a debt-free life. We looked at our circumstances and we recognized that a lack of self-control, that preoccupation with accumulation had caused us to make some decisions that had put us in debt. And we needed to deal with that in our lives. And at the time I was reading an incredible book by a man named Robert Morris called The Blessed Life. And Robert Morris shares his own story of getting into debt and then recognizing that wasn't God's best and having to deal with that debt. And what he did is, Robert Morris says that he and his wife, when they realized they were in these circumstances, they adopted a posture of repentance. And he said, for us, that looked like doing everything that we could to repay our debt early. They didn't stop giving. In fact, they really taught that more generosity is a key principle, just as I am. More generosity is a key principle of unlocking the more that God has for us. But he said, we then looked at everything else we were spending. We didn't go out for food. We were careful about what we spent our money on. We didn't take holidays so that we could clear our debt quickly. And he made this statement. He said, today I hear people talk about getting debt-free all the time. But when they talk about getting debt-free, they're not willing to make any changes in their life. They still live as they lived before. And so that vision to become debt-free doesn't become a reality. Naomi and I, we really felt that for us to become debt-free, It had to be a priority. And so we made it a priority. And the incredible thing for us was that as we made it a priority, God came through for us over and over again. So we were able to become debt-free quicker than we expected because of God's blessing and favor in pursuit of that. Generation Generous isn't something that we'll become as we get richer. It's something that we're called to be right now. We're called to get a vision for generosity in our lives, to live lives of generosity. And the way that we do that, the way that we try to work this out in our circumstances, is that we've got a vision for our finances, a vision for our generosity that's built around giving more, budgeting well, clearing debt, and then starting to save our money. I believe that as we do this, as we chase after this goal of becoming Generation Generous, we have opportunity to make an impact on the world all around us through living generous lives. As we give more of our finances, it releases generosity in our own lives. We start to become more generous people and live in more generous ways. And as we do that, we unlock more of what God has for our lives. My prayer is, as we put this to work in our lives, we'll get to write incredible testimonies of God's abundance in the area of provision. We'll get to write incredible testimonies of the difference that we're able to make in the world around us. And we'll get to write testimonies of seeing the difference in our own lives as well.